Good afternoon, everybody. I'm thankful for the invitation to speak at this seminar. It's an important seminar that looks at a very pressing issue facing Tamil peoples on the island of Sri Lanka. And my presentation this afternoon focuses on the post-war nature of the land issues faced by the Tamil people on the island of Sri Lanka in relation to what I call the national question. Now, before I start, I need to clarify as to what I mean by this term national question. It's a term that has been used in the discourse on the Sri Lankan ethnic conflict for a very long period of time. But just to sort of put in a very summarized way, what I mean by the national question is the nature of the Sri Lankan state as a hierarchical state, where the singular nation is the dominant nation / community that looks at all other communities within Sri Lanka as subservient and subordinate to its presence within the state. What I mean is that Sri Lanka is a hierarchical ethnocratic state wherein the other communities can only live as either minorities or as individuals who are subservient to a singular Buddhist conception of the Sri Lankan state. Now, let me also clarify as to how I understand the post-war scenario. Both in international as well as discourse in Sri Lanka, the post-war discourse is dominated by the language of reconciliation, which I think is inappropriate in characterizing the post-war context. I look at the post-war scenario as a refocusing, reconverging, and a rebuilding of the singular Buddhist character of the state as a process of de-ethnicizing the conflict, as a process that has led to the national question being no more the important issue in Sri Lanka, and of a very permanent presence of the singular Buddhist nation in the national space on the island of Sri Lanka. Within that context, the Tamils are seen as a very problematic community, as they were during the war and in the lead up to the conflict. And Tamil self-determination in the post-war context is criminalized, is problematized to the extent that Tamils are being told that self-determination politics is not something they can pursue, whether that self-determination project has a separatist aspect to it or has an internal dimension to its struggle. Now, given my understanding of the national question and how I characterize the post-war situation, it's important to look at what the post-war land issues are. I mean, we've heard both at the inaugural event at the House of Commons, as well as through speeches that you would have heard this morning, as to the nature of the land issues. I look at the land issues, and this might be repetitive in terms of what has been already said in the morning, as having a dual sort of objective. The dual objective is that one, it focuses on militarization, on entrenching militarization, and number two, on entrenching singular Buddhization of the north and east. Now, this is something that has been commented on. Now, if you look at Nirmal Ranjit Devasri, Dr. Nirmal Ranjit Devasri was a senior lecturer in history at the University of Colombo. He has published recently a paper for the International Center for Ethnic Studies, where he talks about how singular Buddhist nationalism is having a re-life in the post-war context. And he says the distinctive feature of the post-war re-articulation of singular Buddhist Mahavamsa tradition type ideology is that it is becoming an everyday aspect of the life of the singular Buddhist nation. And part of the singular Buddhist narrative of the post-war situation, which I think is a carry-on. I mean, it has a continuing aspect to it. Definitely, a definite character of the post-war narrative of singular Buddhist nationalism is to redefine and rename the northeast of Sri Lanka as being singular Buddhist, and to reclaim it from the view of singular Buddhist nationalism as the singular Buddhists being the legitimate owners of the north and east. Now, political geographers like Yiftachel and Ganam have said that ethnocratic regimes what you see like the Sri Lankan state look at the central part of that state's project is a geographical project of ethnicizing contested territories. Now, this involves, in the Sri Lankan context, in the post war scenario, again, a continuation of what has been happening in the past 60 years, a claiming of the territory, as I said, as belonging to the singular Buddhist. And that is where this militarization and singular Buddhization, though I call them as two different objectives, they're very much intertwined with each other. Now, this involves, as many of you know, renaming names of villages, of cities, towns in northeast as with singular names, taking over of land, both private and state, belonging to the Tamils, where they have inhabited for historical times, to the singular Buddhist forces. And this largely happens through a national security mindset, where there is an overwhelming presence of the military. There is constant contestation as to what the figures, what the numerical figures of the militarization is. But we know in terms of experiential living, that there's a very high presence. I mean, in Jaffna we speak of the military presence of being as 1:4 being the ratio between civilians, between the army and the civilians, whereas in the Vanni in the Vanni it being 1:4 and Jaffna it being 1:11. Now, the larger project of militarization is normalizing the presence of the military. Hence, the military's involvement in daily social and political and economic aspects of the life of the people, and through that, making the military a naturalized part of the population. That's a distinct objective. Now, along with that, you get symbols of singular Buddhist nationalism that come about. It is the army, this needs to be emphasized, it is the armed forces that actually establish the singular Buddhist symbols such as Buddhist viharas. I mean, the two big ones that have been opened in Kilnochi and Mullaitivu were constructed by the army, and they were ceremoniously opened by the defense secretary and the Sri Lankan army commander. The national security policy and the singular Buddhization project go hand in hand and are very much intertwined with each other, and hence my argument that the character of militarization as a Tamil problem is distinct from the general militarization problem that is being argued about in Sri Lanka. I mean, I say this, and I think this is very important to note, because a lot of people, there is a lot of discourse that looks at militarization as an issue that is faced by Sri Lankans as a whole, as a common issue. Whereas I think there is this distinctive feature to militarization in the North and East, which is about its singular Buddhist character, which is about about reclaiming territory, so on and so forth. So now these are important to look at. I mean, I think I don't want to take a lot of time in terms of employing how one justifies the Tamil notion of traditional homeland. But may I just say this very quickly? I mean, we know the arguments put forward by historians Professor K.M.D. Silva and geographers like Professor G.H. Pires. And for those of you who want, you can read these two scholars in terms of their critique of traditional homeland, but also probably look at Professor Sangaran Krishna's response to their critique. And the gist of it is this: that KMD Silva and GH Pires appropriate liberal terminology to argue that the national space of Sri Lanka is liberal. It's something that is occupied by the citizens of Sri Lanka, that there is no part of the country that is occupied by a particular ethnicity. Whereas Sangaran Krishna asks, I mean, that modernist sort of discourse of the national space being secular doesn't really sit pretty with the constitutional character and the political character of the state, which is singular Buddhist. When I say the constitutional character of the state, Buddhism remains the remains the religion that is fostered by the state. So in a sense, Sri Lanka then essentially means to employ the narrative of a liberal Sri Lanka, where it doesn't matter as to what ethnicity that you belongs to, actually comes from denies the real situation of Sri Lanka really being a singular Buddhist state, both by constitutional characterization but also by the way politics is done. I just want to say that this is definitely true in terms of how it works out with the land issue as well, because it played out pretty well, quite in a fashion where people were able to note quite closely in the Northeast demerger case. Now this is where the 13th Amendment of the Indo-Lanka Accord provided for the merger of the Northeast provinces. These are the two provinces that the Tamils consider to be their traditional homeland. Now, in the judgment that Chief Justice Sarathan Silva, as he was at the time, delivered demerging the Northeast, Sarathan Silva employs the language of liberal rights to justify as to why the whole country is equal under the law, every citizen is equal under the law. Let me just quote one paragraph from this case. The case is Vijayasagara versus Attorney General 2007, on Sri Lanka Law Reports, page 38, for those of you who are interested in the case. And this particular paragraph, and I quote Sarathan Silva, quote, "The elements of race, religion and language characterize ethnicity that tends to divide people. Caste, sex, political opinion and place of birth are sub-elements of further divisions between people. In contrast, the equal protection of the law unifies people on the basis of the rule of law and the peaceful resolution of dispute that characterizes the exercise of judicial power." I'm leaving out certain bits. Then he goes on to say, "From this perspective, the physical identification of a unit of devolution of legislative and executive power being the bone of contention diminishes in significance." So what he's trying to say is that when everyone is equal before the law, when there is rule of law, when there is equality before the law, that a particular area is identified with a particular ethnicity becomes irrelevant, and irrelevant to the whole analysis in terms of how you design public policy choices. Now this is the fallacy of employing liberal arguments, and this is something that is now employed by the Defense Secretary Gotabaya Rajapaksa. In an interview that Gotabaya Rajapaksa gave in May 2012 to BBC about charges of trying to force demographic changes in the northern province, his response was that this has nothing to do with demographic changes, but really a commitment to the freedom of movement as enshrined in the Sri Lankan constitution. So what I want to drive, the point that I want to drive home, this panel is about advocacy and legal strategies, is that a rule of law approach, a good governance approach, a liberal individual rights approach to this problem does not resolve the problems. Because unless you are able to recognize, unless you are able to go beyond the paradigm of legal rights, unless you are able to go beyond the paradigm of a rule of law conception which is very individual right centric, you won't be able to identify the problem of land. And this is something that a lot of Western sort of players find difficult to digest. The constant application of a liberal rights paradigm to understanding the post-war situation, to understanding the ethnic conflict, and to an understanding of the land problem that the Tamil people face is completely inadequate. We need to get to the group rights paradigm, and when we are talking about group rights, we need to get to the question of self-determination. And I bring in self-determination because, as you know, the right to self-determination is not just a civil and political right as enshrined in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. It is also a right that is enshrined in the International Convention on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, by which you mean a people as defined as the word that is preferred by the International Covenant, or a nation, the more politically mature term of how the Tamils through self-referral call their group identity. the Tamil nation should be able to, whether whatever the institutional setup that we are talking about, whether it's a separate state or an internal arrangement within Sri Lanka, the Tamil nation should be able to control their economic and social resources. And when you look at the legal history with regard to land control, this is where it strikes a problem. The unitary character of the state since the 1930s onwards, and 1931 being an important year when universal franchise was endowed, you had enormous resource of land. State land is probably more than 70% of the country's usable land territory. So 70% of the land is given over to a unitary state controlled by a centralized government that has entire control over that resource, and hence the debate over the national question has figured the land issue very much centrally. Be it the Land Development Ordinance of 1935 or the Strategic Development Act of 2008, all these are legal instruments with regard to land, which when it's utilized and provided for by a unitary state that is entirely controlled by a particular ethnicity in terms of a very hegemonic vision of the state, that is where the problem lies. And if this is the identification of the problem, we will see that the resolution of the problem will come about only through a group rights paradigm that recognizes the claim to self-determination of the Tamil people and makes a sincere effort to resolve the question. Now, I know that I've taken a lot of time, but given the importance of, given the what I would say, enforced in a sense, thrusted upon the importance of the 13th Amendment on the Tamil people, and by the 13th Amendment I refer to the establishment of the provincial council system, which was a fallout of the Indo-Lanka Accord in the late 1980s. Now, there are people, including the Tamil National Alliance, who have taken up the position that the 13th Amendment and the provincial council system provide for certain land powers which might help in resolving the problem. And I'm referring both to TNA's manifesto in the Northern Provincial Council manifesto, but also an article written by one of their prominent parliamentarians in response to a certain judgment on land powers issued by the Supreme Court recently. Now, the 13th Amendment is very clear. The 13th Amendment is very clear in that state land is a matter that shall reside not just with the unitary state, but its apex most institution, the presidency. Article 33D of the Constitution provides state land as a subject matter that is entirely controlled by the president. Now, if you look at the appendix with regard to land in the 13th Amendment, there is of course item 1.3, what is referred to as item 1.3, which says that the respective province has to be consulted when the issuing of state land is concerned, when dealing with the subject of state land. Now, this has been the subject of a couple of cases before the Supreme Court. The more recent one delivered by the de facto Chief Justice Mohan Peiris, which came up in a lot of discussion. This was the case of Solamuthu Rasa versus Superintendent Stafford Estate, Supreme Court Minutes 26/9/2013. So a judgment delivered in September 2013, and a judgment issued by Chief Justice Sarathan Silva in 2000, reported in the 2008 Sri Lanka Law Reports, which is Vasudevan Anekara versus Choksi and others. Now, in the earlier case, in 2007 or 8, Chief Justice Sarathan Silva delivered a judgment saying that there is in place an interactive regime whereby the center and state have to be both involved in the question of how state land is distributed. Now, Mohan Peiris, the current de facto Chief Justice, as his judgment in September 2013, doubts the interpretation of Chief Justice Sarathan Silva of that of item 1.3 in the appendix, and he goes on to say that the province has to be only consulted, and that the decision very much remains with the central government. Now, I think, devoid of political positions in terms of how we want to characterize the 13th Amendment, it would sound controversial for me to support Chief Justice Mohan Peiris' conclusion, but if you look at the scheme of the 13th Amendment and the plain wording of the 13th Amendment, clearly it was only put in as a consultative regime. So my position is that it is useless to talk about the 13th Amendment as providing the framework through which some form of land powers could be enjoyed by the Tamil people, by the Tamil nation through the provincial council system. That possibility does not arise. But I want to make a further point, which is my final point. The further point is that given the character of the state, that I don't think Tamils can afford to waste time, and I know that these are strong words, within the current legal framework, because one, there is the trust level, the nature of the Sri Lankan state is such that any sort of constitutional arrangement that is in place, including the 13th Amendment, cannot, when interpreted within the political framework within which it sits, which is singular Buddhist nationalism, would always veer towards the different institutions, be it the presidency, be it the courts, be it any institution, would veer towards an interpretation of those provinces which would favor a singular Buddhist nationalist political agenda. And so, despite the fact that now I myself personally am involved in a number of cases that we filed recently, where land of the extent of 6,300 plus acres have been legally noticed to be taken over for the Sri Lankan Armed Forces in Jaffna. We know very well now, in terms of legal strategies, we've approached the Supreme Court, and the only reason we've approached the Supreme Court is because we want this issue to be documented, and that forum provides for the opportunity of bringing out the matter. And also, in a sense that for people who are aware of the international law terminology, that you have to exhaust remedies locally before you can. Now, I'm of course of the opinion that the Tamils have spent all these years trying to show that remedies within a Sri Lankan state have been truly exhausted. And hence my plea is that there are elements within the Tamil political class which think that there are legal solutions to the political problems faced by the Tamil people, and I don't think there are legal solutions to these questions. We need to get back to the real underlying problem. The real underlying problem is the character of the state, and unless the character of the state, which is the hierarchical state of Sri Lanka, with the singular nation being on top and all other communities and nations and peoples being subservient to that, changes, we are not going to find a solution to the problem. There's one point that I forgot to mention when I was mentioning militarization. Because it's a current topic, I just want to comment on that and wrap up. There's a lot of debate, for example, given the importance given by the Tamil National Alliance in the Northern Provincial Council election, in their manifesto, and even the aftermath, about the need for demilitarization. There is a paper by Rajesh Venugopal, which he published for the Economic and Political Weekly, titled "The Politics of Market Reform at a Time of Civil War, Military Fiscalism in Sri Lanka," where he argues, as some others also have pointed out, that the military is a most important government recruiter in terms of employment, and it caters to a very large, significant population, politically significant population, which is a singular rural youth. Today, the social security schemes of the Sri Lankan state primarily are run through the Sri Lankan Armed Forces, through the military budget. That the largest social security program is run through the military. The point that I'm trying to make using Rajesh Venugopal's argument is that there is no real scope or internal incentive for the Sri Lankan state to demilitarize. Because if they demilitarize, there is a positive component to the militarization aspect, which I have already argued, which is about singular Buddhization, take over the north and east, claiming back the territory of the north and east. But there is also the subservient, the secondary sort of problem of, if you engage in demilitarization, that being running counter to the singular Buddhist project, wherein the singular rural youth and their sort of economic problems are really sort of tried in a nexus with the militarization program, that if you try to untangle that nexus, that you might have a problem among the singular rural youth. So I just want to stress that whatever advocacy work that we do takes note of this very realist position, which is that the Sri Lankan state cannot and will not demilitarize. There is no such internal incentive for them to do that. And number two, that when thinking about legal strategies, that we have to remember that the underlying problem is really about the character of the state, and that whatever that we try to tinker within the framework of the existing state are not going to resolve the problems of the Tamil people, including the land issue that this seminar is seeking to address. Thank you very much.